It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when Officer Mike Jacobs rolled out of bed, put on his uniform, and headed out for his shift. Officer Jacobs was a man of routine. He liked things in order, the same every day. His beat was the quiet suburban part of town, where he rarely encountered anything more than minor traffic violations. But Jacobs had a way of looking at people. He made assumptions about who should be in certain neighborhoods, what kinds of cars people should drive, and who looked out of place. Unfortunately, more often than not, those assumptions were based on skin color. Today, however, was going to be different. The universe had plans for Officer Jacobs. Around mid-morning, Jacobs noticed a sleek black SUV cruising through one of the wealthier neighborhoods. The driver, a tall black man in a tailored suit, didn't look like the type of person Jacobs was used to seeing around here. Suspicion quickly grew in his mind, though there was no reason for it. "What's this guy doing here?" Jacobs muttered under his breath. His gut, or more accurately, his bias, told him something was off. So he flipped on his lights and pulled the SUV over. Jacobs strutted up to the car with an air of authority, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to remind the driver who had the power here. The window rolled down, revealing the man behind the wheel. He was calm, collected, and didn't seem at all fazed by the flashing lights or Jacobs' approach. "License and registration," Jacobs barked. The man nodded calmly, reaching for his documents. "Sure, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Jacobs wasn't about to explain himself. "Just give me the papers. I'll let you know." The man complied, handing over his ID and registration. Jacobs glanced at the license, but he didn't recognize the name. He didn't care to either. To him, it didn't matter. A black man driving a fancy car in this neighborhood? It just didn't sit right. "I'll be right back," Jacobs said, turning on his heel and heading to his patrol car. Sitting in the squad car, Jacobs ran the man's information. Everything came back clean. No warrants, no tickets, nothing. But Jacobs wasn't satisfied. Something had to be wrong. He lingered at his computer, trying to think of a reason to keep the man longer. Just then, another police car pulled up behind him. Jacobs' partner, Officer Taylor, stepped out. Taylor was younger, a little more open-minded, but he followed Jacobs' lead. He walked up to the patrol car and leaned in through the window. "What's going on, Jacobs?" Taylor asked. Jacobs shrugged. Guy looked out of place, pulled him over to check things out. Taylor glanced at the SUV and then back at Jacobs. "Anything come up?" Jacobs shook his head, frustration building. "No, but something's not right. I just know it." Without waiting for a response, Jacobs stepped out of his patrol car and marched back to the SUV. This time, his tone was sharper. "Step out of the vehicle," Jacobs ordered. The man raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said, step out of the vehicle," Jacobs repeated. The man sighed but unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out, towering over Jacobs, but maintaining a calm demeanor. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening here." Jacobs wasn't interested in explaining himself. "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered. At this point, Officer Taylor was watching from a distance, clearly uncomfortable but unsure whether to intervene. The man complied, placing his hands on the hood of the SUV. Jacobs patted him down, looking for anything that would justify the stop. Drugs, weapons, anything. But there was nothing. "Officer," the man said, his voice steady but firm, "I think you've made a mistake." Jacobs scoffed. "Mistake? I don't think so. Now what are you doing in this neighborhood?" The man paused, a slight smirk crossing his face. "I live here." Jacobs' eyes narrowed. He didn't believe it. Before he could respond, the man turned slightly, still keeping his hands on the car. "You might want to check my ID again. Look at my job title." Jacobs pulled the license out of his pocket and glanced at it. He'd looked at the name before, but not closely enough. This time, his eyes widened. He blinked as if not believing what he was seeing. The ID read, "Special Agent Marcus Bryant, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Jacobs felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the ID, then back at the man standing in front of him. His mind raced. He'd just pulled over and was trying to arrest a federal agent. Bryant straightened up, turning to face Jacobs fully now. His calm demeanor remained, but there was a new edge to his voice. "I work for the FBI, officer. And unless you have a valid reason for pulling me over and searching me, I suggest you let me go. Jacob stammered, his usual confidence evaporating. I didn't realize. That's the problem, isn't it? Bryant cut him off. You didn't realize who I was. You just saw a black man in a nice car and assumed I didn't belong here. Jacobs opened his mouth to argue, but he couldn't. Everything Bryant was saying was true. He'd made a snap judgment, one based entirely on skin color, and now he was paying the price for it. Bryant continued, his voice still calm but authoritative. You see, officer, this is what people like me deal with every day. We're judged, harassed, and treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of our skin. I could have easily been just another guy, and you would have treated me the same way. But I'm not just another guy. I'm a federal agent, and you made a big mistake today. Jacob stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Bryant sighed, shaking his head. Look, I could report this. I could make a formal complaint and have you investigated. But I won't. Not because you don't deserve it, but because I want you to learn something from this. Jacobs blinked, surprised. He wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or even more ashamed. Bryant stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly. You need to check your bias, officer. Not just today, but every day. Because next time, it might not be someone who's willing to let it slide. And believe me, you don't want that. With that, Bryant turned and walked back to his SUV, climbing in and shutting the door. Jacob stood there, still holding the ID in his hand, as the SUV pulled away and disappeared down the street. Officer Taylor approached cautiously. What just happened? He asked. Jacobs didn't answer right away. He stared down at the ground, the weight of the moment sinking in. Finally, he muttered, I messed up. Taylor nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. He knew this was something Jacobs would have to process on his own. As Jacobs got back into his patrol car, he felt different. Embarrassed, sure, but also changed. Maybe today wasn't just about catching criminals or writing tickets. Maybe today was about something bigger, a lesson he needed to learn, a lesson in humility, in fairness, in seeing people for who they really are, not just for what he assumed them to be. And from that day forward, Officer Jacobs never forgot the name Marcus Bryant or the lesson he'd learned. Before you're gone, don't forget to subscribe and like. Otherwise, Jacob also going to pull you over.